Hello, I'm Greg with Bronwell Wrights. Today we're going to get into the third part of our series on brass trimming considerations. I know some of you are thinking, gracious sakes, 3 parts, 3 episodes just on trimming brass? What more can we possibly talk about? uh, I understand that. There's probably some of you that are thinking by now that, this is just too much effort. This is just too much work. I don't even want to trim my brass, and that's fine. Everyone has to decide their own level of commitment to this discipline, and some people are quite happy with a certain level of performance that might not be the best that you can possibly achieve. However, I can assure you that if you do want to achieve the best possible performance from your rifle, from your hand loads, then this is all very important stuff, folks. Now, despite all the information that we've shared so far on the previous episodes, we haven't talked about when to trim. The answer to that question is every firing. The brass growth that takes place between each firing can be documented fairly easily. You just use your caliper and you take a measurement of the brass, and you can track just how much the brass is growing. Now, why does the brass grow? Well, the brass is soft and malleable, especially up toward the top. Now, down at the base of the case, obviously, it's designed to be as hard as it can be. So you have your brass with a disparity of construction from the bottom to the top. And down here at the bottom, the case is designed to be very hard and not move around. We want as strong and rigid and robust of a base of the case as we can get. Then as we approach the shoulder up the body here, we want the brass to start being able to be malleable. And this is what allows the neck and the upper body and shoulder area to expand and seal off the chamber. Now, a lot of you have fired different combinations of components, and you've seen the powder residue on the exterior of the brass. Now, if your brass is functioning properly, you will see some residue up here on the neck, very likely, and maybe just a tiny bit as you get beneath the neck down onto the shoulder. But if your brass is functioning properly, there should only be the tiniest amount of residue up on the neck and none on the shoulder or body of the case. What's happening if you have a residue along this area down beneath your neck is the brass is not opening up and sealing off your chamber up here at the case mouth in the appropriate time. So essentially, the pressure curve is not correct to apply enough pressure to the brass to get it to open up at the top and seal off the chamber. And before it has a chance to do that, some of that hot gas and expanding propellant finds its way squeezing in between the chamber walls and the brass. And that's why you get that residue down there along the shoulder and body of your case. Now, this can be extreme in the sense that if your brass isn't, during the firing event, it's never properly sealing off. Well, you can find residue all the way down the length of your case. Now, of course, this is something we see a lot in semi-autos that are improperly timed, because the semi-auto is unlocking and extracting that case before the pressure has been fully relieved from the barrel. And that causes that gas to blow back, and of course all that residue and soot-like substance is all along the case. Well, there's a lot of reasons why this could be happening, and one of the most common is people using improper components, either wrong powders for the bullet that they're using, or brass that is not constructed properly. And despite what some of you may think, there's actually a lot of brass out there that is not designed properly. The wall thickness and the density of the material, the softness or hardness of the brass isn't correct for the geometry of the case or the components that are generally going to be used with it. But I would say that the most common thing is for people to use powders with bullets that they're not necessarily designed to play well with. And so the timing of this event happens improperly. Now, there's a lot of things that you can do to remedy this. Obviously, you can just change to a different powder. You can use a different powder charge. If you're using the correct powder, but not in the correct amount, for instance, if you're running too low of a charge weight, that by itself can cause this expansion problem. Now, the other consideration, though, is just the thickness of your brass, the thickness and hardness of your brass. The hardness, obviously, you can remedy that by annealing. Now, I anneal every time I fire my brass. The first thing that happens when I come back from a session is I put my brass through the annealer. The entire batch, all at the same time, at the same settings. It's important that you have the correct settings, whether you're using a flame annealer or an induction annealer. You have to anneal it correctly, but it's ultra important that you don't change the settings. So you don't adjust the flame or adjust the time or adjust your annealer while you're in the middle of a batch of brass. You don't want the differences to be spread throughout the brass. You want them, if they're going to be partially annealed wrong, it'd be better to have them all annealed the same way, partially wrong, than it would be to adjust it in between and have some of them all the way right and others some wrong. So uniformity is key here. Now, another thing that you can do to correct this pressure issue is to neck turn. If your brass is too thick, and this often happens when we're necking down a Wildcat, such as in the case of the 22 PRC Primal, the brass may start out in 6.5 at a 14 thousandths thick neck thickness. And when we neck it down to 6 millimeter, it'll often pick up 1,000th in size. When we knock it down to 22, it'll probably pick up another 1,000th or close to it. And that thickness is changing because we are constricting the diameter, and not all of the brass is flowing out. So because not all of the brass is flowing out, it's actually just growing in thickness. So we're moving too much of it for it to actually all flow out the top. Okay, this leads us to the point of this particular part in this series. Why would we need to trim every firing? Well, because of the factors that I just described about how the brass intrinsically moves and flows, every time we perform an operation to the brass, we are actually growing the brass. So when we fire these cases in our chamber, they're subjected to a tremendous amount of pressure, generally between 50 and 65,000 psi. Obviously, most cartridges are going to be running in that 55 to 60,000 psi range. If your name's Kyle and you're the internet expert, well then you might be running 90,000 psi every firing, but we won't get into that. This concept of brass growth typically happens after we run it through our sizing die, because as we size this case, the dimension is squeezed, right? We're pushing this malleable case into a pocket that is smaller than it is. So as it's squeezed on the sides, all the way up and down the side of this case, it can't go out the bottom because the shell holder or the shell plate is there stopping it from going out the bottom. And then this portion of the case is very hard. And so it's going to resist movement anyway, right? It's harder and more brittle. So as we squeeze this thing into the sizing die, this softer, more malleable brass up here at the top is going to try to escape because we're constricting it from the side, so it just doesn't have anywhere to go but up. So as you squeeze it from the sides, it's going to squirt out the top. It's going to flow out the top. And so after you resize your case, and if you have the sizing die set up properly, this brass is going to grow. And that growth is going to happen only as uniformly as the material will allow. So if you're not annealing every firing, then every time you fire, the brass is going to have a different hardness. That different hardness is going to mean that when you put it into your sizing die, it's going to not be resized the same way every time, because the material is going to resist and spring back differently based on the hardness of the brass. So this annealing thing, people tend to think it's solely to extend the life of your brass and combat split necks and those types of things. And while that is true, the primary reason that I anneal is to maintain the consistency of this behavior, to maintain the consistency of how this brass moves and flows, so that I can predict its behavior when I'm sizing it or performing any other op. Well, how does this affect us when we're trimming the case? Well, just as the hardness of the brass affects how it will behave during resizing, the hardness of the brass also affects how we will trim it, because the resistance to our cutting tool is dependent upon how hard the material is. Now that I've mentioned it out loud, some of you are thinking, oh, well, that makes a lot of sense. But these things often aren't self-evident until you've had some problem with one of these processes and had to troubleshoot it and figure out why you can't get uniformity or what's going on. So this means that as you're processing your brass, you can't ever look at one particular operation in a vacuum. You can't look at the operation that you're performing as if it's not tied to the other things that are going on in your process. A lot of you that have spoken to me on the phone in our mentorship program have heard me talk about the necessity of having a healthy ecosystem. And the ecosystem that I'm referring to there is everything that any of this touches. Every single thing in the process. That means your optic, your rifle, the turrets on your optic, the optic's ability to track properly, all of your reloading equipment at the reloading bench, and how you're operating that equipment. Your knowledge of these types of variables is what is the determining factor of whether or not you're going to be successful in any of the other steps. So leaving one thing behind in the process and not doing that correctly can actually lead to you not being able to do anything else correctly after that. So the importance of knowing what you're doing before you do it, especially with brass, is extraordinarily important. The entirety of whether or not you're going to be able to be successful in creating high precision, very uniform and predictable ammunition is whether or not you understand the importance of this brass. Your accuracy and precision capability almost universally comes down to how much you understand about this little thing. Your cartridge cases, your brass, is probably the most important factor in this entire game. If the brass is not behaving predictably, you will never have a predictable performance downrange. And these small non-uniformities that you can introduce into your process will have a massive effect on how this brass behaves and moves. The trimming aspect of this, while important, is only one thing in a series of ultra important things that need to happen to each and every cartridge case in your batch uniformly in order to have anything work out correctly downrange. So this act of trimming your brass, it is permanent. You can't untrim it once you've cut it off, okay? And so knowing what you're doing and making sure that the trimming is being done correctly is ultra important, because it's just very permanent. There's a lot of things that we can mess up in this discipline and we can recover from, and it doesn't necessarily cost us anything, just a little bit of time. And then too, that time necessarily is there as a function of us learning. And so the time we spend isn't lost, it's just lessons learned. Well, in the case of this brass, you really can lose out big. Some of this brass is very expensive. If you're dealing with very large cartridges that are kind of rare, you can pay as much as $6 or $7 or $8 for a piece of brass, a single piece of brass. And so not understanding what you're doing can have a very costly consequence. If you're working with $1,000 worth of brass and you accidentally do an operation to that brass that it cannot be recovered, that's a pretty traumatic thing. So making sure that your brass is all treated uniformly across the batch, that there's nothing that's happening to one or two pieces that isn't happening the exact same way as the rest of the brass, is ultra important, because that every time you touch it or do something with the brass, it will change. And it is not as if it just will forget what happened, okay? So if I'm working with a batch of brass and I find myself like getting ahead of myself, or I do something out of process, that's not an operation that can be recovered. Now, just the other day, I was starting through some brass, and I was fire forming, and I realized that I had a charge weight that was just a little bit too low, and I had about 1 out of every 10. I had fired 10 cases, and there was 1 or 2 of them that didn't get properly formed. And for some reason, whether it be this barrel, it was a brand new barrel that I hadn't worked with before, and there was 2 out of 10 that just didn't get fully properly formed, and so I had to step the charge weight up another grain to form it. Now, I had to take those 10 pieces that I used and fired with a different charge weight, I had to pull those aside because they were not going to be the same as the rest. So I had to grab 10 new pieces and get them back to the same spot using the exact same technique, the same die in the same location, and get those pieces of brass back to where the rest of them were, pull those 10 aside, because they will never be the same again. They will never be the same as the rest of them, having fired a charge that is 1 grain less. Now, the same thing is true if you would have used one annealer setting on part of the brass and not the other. If you would have used one die setting on one batch of, or one part of the batch, and used a different die setting on the other. Any little thing that you do that's different, anything that you do out of sequence, will alter how the brass functions. And that small non-uniformity that happens is why we have to keep a brass log. Now, it's super important to keep a log of every op that you do to your brass so that you know when it took place in sequence, and to make sure that they're all being handled the same way. Now, we're doing a lot of talking about things that are not trimming on this particular part, but you see now how this is all tied together. The trimming is a permanent act, and it has to be done correctly, and you can't undo it once it's done. So having your brass be ultra uniform before you present it to the cutting tool is of paramount importance, because if you can't keep the uniformity in your process and the other areas of your ecosystem, then the trimming will not be done uniformly either. And the cutting tool will not behave the same way against the material if there's a disparity in the material. Well, that's all we have for today. Thank you for watching this episode, and if you found it interesting, please do hit that little thumbs up icon down there in the bottom. And if you're not subscribed already, please do subscribe, as that really helps our engagement with the YouTube algorithm.